Hello, welcome back to Autism Unpacked. Receiving an autism diagnosis for your child can be a journey filled with questions, emotions, and uncertainty. In this special highlights episode, we're bringing together some of our most insightful conversations about the diagnostic process, from recognising the early signs and navigating assessments to understanding what happens after a diagnosis is given. We also explore many of the concerns parents commonly face, including worries about labels, support in school, future outcomes, and how a diagnosis can impact family life.
A common misconception is that labelling a child with autism, with ADHD, is kind of, there's a negative connotation with that. You know, you're giving them a lifetime label, and often they're too young to consent. So I've been labelled with autism and ADHD, proudly so. But as a teenager, I was labelled with various things, potentially borderline personality disorder, eating disorders, depression. So in your view, and I'm going to come to you, Freya, first, what would you say are the primary reasons that you would want to get your child a diagnosis?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I think that's a really, really important question. I think for me, one of the main reasons I would say to a family member or a parent or carer who is seeking a diagnosis for their child, where they'd seen that maybe the child was developing in a slightly different way compared to their peers, is I think about what they were hoping to get from the diagnosis. And I think for me, a diagnosis can bring lots of different benefits. So it can bring the family a really good opportunity to understand that child's unique strengths and needs. It can bring the right educational support for that child. And I think more importantly for me, it's about that child really understanding their own identity. If you continually compare yourself to your peers who are neurotypical, you're going to kind of feel a little bit rubbish because you're not going to be the same as them. And you may always feel like you're falling short. If you actually realize, do you know what, my brain is neurodivergent, I'm a little bit different, I do things a little bit differently, suddenly it's not that I'm rubbish, it's that I'm different. And I think that for me is so empowering. And we know that young people who get an early diagnosis actually go on to experience less mental health conditions, they have better well-being, they have better self-esteem. And these things are crucial for us. And I think the misdiagnosis that you've experienced, I think that's really unfortunate for many people because they've had diagnoses where they've had to have, say, treatments or attempts for things to change. Whereas actually, if we embrace someone's neurodivergence, we're not looking at change. We're not looking at deficit anymore. We're looking at difference. And that allows us to think about reasonable adaptations for the environment around us, reasonable adaptations for the people around us, but also things that we can do ourselves. What are the things that we need to do that we maybe need to learn new skills at? And what are the things that we just need to, embrace and celebrate about ourselves?
Yeah, I completely agree because there's a lot of criticism in the autistic mind, and actually giving yourself that empathy and the understanding. You can only do that if you know who you are. So it's different, not less, isn't it? That's a really nice way to describe it. If you are looking to have a diagnosis, either for yourself or for your child, then what would you say would be the sort of the process? Where do you begin, and how does the process work?
The assessment process would take up a few different aspects, really. So one of those would be a full neurodevelopmental family history. So they'd be looking at your own differences. So let's say we'll just talk at the moment about an assessment for a child. Mm-hmm. So as a parent, you'd be going through the developmental stages of your child, what the pregnancy was like, what the birth was like, how they hit their developmental milestones, any differerences you noticed, whether those were strengths or whether those were areas of need, any delays you might have noticed. And they would go right up to kind of like they would go right up to the current date. So your child's whole life would be discussed with you as a parent. Another section of the assessment would be either a play-based or interview with the young person themselves, depending on their age and stage. For me, it's really important that session is always very much child-led. So there are kind of goal-based standards of assessments out there. So there is an assessment called the ADOS. So families may hear that term being used. The ADOS stands for the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, but it isn't the only one out there. There are lots of other observational assessments that you can do as a clinician, whether you be a speech and language therapist or a psychologist, that would work on different ways of interacting with a young person. So maybe an assessment with a young person, for example, we might be playing bubbles and kind of doing 1, 2, 3, and the young person will go yay, whereas an autistic young person might go 1, 2, 3, 4. what are we doing? Why are we doing this? I'm not interested in this. So there's loads of different things that we look for. And as the children or the child or the young person gets older, we'd be having more of that conversational with them. So we'd be asking them, how are your experiences of school? What do you like about being with your friends? What are some of the things you may find tricky? What are your intense interests? What are the things that you love and are passionate about more than anything else? So there's a whole load of things that we would do as part of that young person's assessment to really better understand that young person's experiences, really. We would also reach out to their school. So we would talk to their young person's school. We might go and do an observation at that young person's school. So the young person wouldn't always know that we were watching. So young people out there, you don't have to be worried that there's people spying on you in schools. But it's about really getting an understanding of that young person across a range of different areas. So then all that information that would be gathered would then be discussed by what we'd call a multidisciplinary team of professionals. So that basically means when there's not one person who has the same profession. So as I was mentioning before, it might be an occupational therapist, a clinical psychologist, a speech language therapist. So you'd have a team of professionals who would discuss all that information. And then what they would do is they would reference that according to the DSM, so the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which we spoke about earlier. And then they would check whether that young person was hitting those diagnostic markers. And I think for me, the diagnostic conversations and the diagnostic formulations I have with my team or when I'm working with students is something that we've kind of moved away from. Is this not just about different? It's not just about deficit anymore. This is about difference. Is it rather that this person maybe has an altered quality to their eye contact? So I'm not just saying, their eye contact isn't very good. I'd be saying actually they prefer not to make eye contact. Actually, their eye contact is more fleeting than it is constant. So we'd be looking at those sorts of things and we'd go through those diagnostic kind of almost checklists. But again, I always reassure people, a diagnosis isn't a tick box list. It's actually an experience. And then as part of that diagnostic discussion, it's around helping somebody to understand that this isn't a new thing. This is something that they've always been. It's just a new label. And a sort of a phrase that I always find myself saying when I'm doing diagnostic feedbacks to people is, I'm not telling you something you didn't already know about yourself because you've told me all this information. You've shared with me your experiences, your reflections about what it is like to be you. What I am doing is I'm giving you a label to kind of understand that so other people can understand you as well. And I think for me, it's that diagnosis that can be so helpful in helping them, move forward. Some people see after they've been through a long assessment process or even a long waiting list, that diagnosis is almost the end point. For me, I think that's almost the wrong way around of looking at it. The diagnosis needs to be the starting point. This is our starting point of our new lives on a new journey, moving forward with this new understanding of our new identity.
Because I've got some friends who've gone for diagnosis, we flock together and all that, and they've gone to see typically male doctors who have been quite disparaging of them and have sort of said, actually, you're in a relationship, you make eye contact, therefore you can't possibly be autistic. So I'm wondering how parents can navigate this if they're pretty certain that their child might be autistic, but they then are not given that voice in an assessment. What's the next thing they can do after that?
So that is a common occurrence, actually. So, we are at, I would say, a crossroads really of diagnosis and understanding neurodiversity and neurodivergence at the moment. I personally think that crossroads is a really exciting time, but that does mean that you have a variety of professionals with different qualifications, different levels of training, different understanding of where they are in the difference, not deficit model. And I think for me, if you are if you're having an assessment and you are feeling that you're not being heard, you're feeling that the professionals aren't really understanding you or your child's perspective, to really, voice that and say, actually, do you know what? I don't think you're quite understanding where I'm coming from, or you maybe need to realize that sometimes my child, my daughter, my son, they may mask their difficulties. They may camouflage, they may, just assimilate. So I think that's something that I know a lot of our autistic young people are really good at doing in schools. We just assimilate into the other people around us. We copy what people are doing. And I think if we can get to that point and have those open and honest conversations with the professionals who are assessing us, hopefully that should allow us to kind of move that assessment forward in a way that's both meaningful and gets the right answer for those young people.
So just hypothetically, say I'm a parent, I've waited 4 years for an autism assessment for my child. We're with the clinician and I don't feel that they understand my child. At that point, parents are probably thinking, well, what on earth do I do? I can't wait another 4 years. Can you insist on having a second opinion?
Yes, yeah, you can. So most neurodevelopmental services, so either if you're being assessed as part of a CAMS team, so a child and adolescent mental health service, or a neurodevelopmental service, they will have a second opinion pathway. What I would advise is you go through the whole assessment fully the first time through, because if they're having a multidisciplinary team, you may have one clinician who's maybe a little bit doubtful, but you then may have other clinicians on that team who are going to be able to see different parts of your young person and think, oh, actually, this is neurodiversity. It just maybe looks a little bit different in this young person. So I'd advise to kind of finish that full assessment. So you've got all that detail, go through the report in fine detail to make sure what they've reported in that assessment report is accurate as well to you. So they've understood what you've said. And if you're still not happy with the conclusion, with the assessment, then I would seek a second opinion. And the majority of NHS services will offer a second opinion. And you can even be a little bit more specific. And when you ask for a second opinion, to say you would like somebody, say, for example, you're having a teenage girl assessed who, often are some of the best maskers out there. But maybe you might say, do you know what, I'd like a professional involved with my daughter's reassessment that has got specific training in assessing women and girls, or has specific training in understanding camouflaging and masking. So then hopefully you would get the right professionals as part of your assessment team.
So you're saying basically don't be afraid to ask. If you dispute the diagnosis or lack of diagnosis, don't be afraid to ask and advocate. Primary reasons that a lot of parents will pursue a diagnosis for a child is because we're now very aware of the comorbidities of neurodiversity. So things like mental health issues, in girls, often eating disorders, addictions. And we know that earlier diagnosis has better outcomes for these children. So are you seeing in your professional capacity that children who are diagnosed sooner are having better outcomes?
So I think what a diagnosis does, and the earlier that you get it as a child, means a school can make the adaptations that it needs to. It also prevents misdiagnosis as well, which can often happen. And we used to see a few years ago that, our biggest intake in special school was around secondary age. And actually what we're seeing now is that it's getting lower and lower and lower. So I'm opening, more schools across the country that start at age 4. So we are definitely seeing more diagnosis happening and a better understanding of what that looks like. If you know that you're working with an individual that's autistic, and you know what that child needs through reading the assessment report, you can tailor their education to be focused around their interests, for example, which will really engage them. And from that, you tend to get better outcomes later on. Often you see that difficult stage from primary to secondary transition. And obviously the younger a child has that sort of support around them, the easier they can navigate those sorts of processes as well.
And there's an enormous power in knowing who you are, isn't there? And
absolutely,
how can you possibly navigate a world that isn't really designed for your brain type if you don't know what your brain type is as well? So I personally believe that knowledge in every area is power, but particularly in understanding who you are.
It's their identity at the end of the day. And what I would say to any parents listening who are perhaps a bit unsure about whether to seek diagnosis because of the fear of the label is that actually it opens up a whole new world to those individuals. And I can say that through my work and what I see every day, but also with my own child. It's really transformed his life and his understanding of himself. So really, don't be frightened to go and seek that clarification from someone else.
Does a diagnosis ever change over time? Does autism improve as a child gets older?
Gosh, that's a big question.
Isn't it?
That's a big question, Rosie. So thank you to the parents that sent that one in. I think it unpicks so many different things. So yes, autism does change over time because we all change over time. We all grow up. We all learn new skills. We all have different life experiences. Whether we're neurodivergent, whether we're neurotypical, we all change. So we know that that's going to be part of an autistic person's experience as well. So it might be that you learn a new strategy. It means you can cope in a situation better. It might be that you learn that you can use ear loops to cope in a really busy situation, which when you're 5, you can't say to somebody because you haven't quite figured out why you're so distressed in a busy lunchroom, because all you just know is that distress, that feeling of wanting to get out. As you get a little bit older, you can recognise and maybe tell somebody it's because it hurts my ears. And then you recognise, oh, well, if I hurts my ears, I can put my loops in, and that actually helps me feel, it helps the room be a lot calmer. So your autism hasn't probably changed, it's stayed the same, but your ability to cope in a really busy environment has changed dramatically because you've understood yourself better, or your mum or your dad or your a psychologist or someone has helped you understand that. So we know that, people don't stay the same. We know that things change. I don't like the word improve, that kind of word,
inverted commas, I will say.
I know,
my question.
I know. And I think that's why it is. So for me, because I come from that different standpoint, always, I think when we're thinking about improvement, if I'm thinking about improvement from a perspective as, is that autistic person living their authentic life? Are they happy? Are they achieving? Are they doing the things that make them happy? Has that improved for them? That's wonderful. That's everything that I'd want for them. Have they improved because they're now acting more neurotypical? That's what I'd want less of. That's the bit that makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable, because what we want people to be doing is, living their authentic autistic lives beautifully and, achieving the things that are important to them. So overall question is, yes, we all change. Autistic people will change as they get older. They will learn new strategies. They will have new experiences. Sometimes those experiences might not always be positive as well. So you might have negative experiences, which means you maybe then be more wary of other situations. So you will change, you will shift. And sometimes, again, that will then determine what you're accessing.
When you're looking at autism in girls, what might the signs be and how might they differentiate? And either of you, please feel free to answer this one.
I think one of the problems is that we start with a male bias. And when a teacher or a parent or a clinician sees a boy that is struggling socially, they think, could this be autism? Right. But when they see a girl who's struggling socially, they may think she's shy, social anxiety. So it starts right then, even before we look at how the girl might be showing her autism differently, our mindset is wrong. Yeah. And that's why we also get diagnostic overshadowing from diagnoses we do expect in girls, things like eating disorders, and not looking past the eating disorder to the underlying autism as well.
Okay, so, and again, I'm thinking things like special interests, and Freya, you might be well versed to answer this one. And I myself, I'm not autistic. I was diagnosed in my 40s, and I can remember filling in my forms and thinking, well, I haven't got a special interest. I don't watch trains or, go bird watching or any of the sort of things I thought were more typically autistic. But what I do have is a very intense interest in fashion and clothes, and I have all my life. And I'm very, very particular, and things will have to be very, very, very precisely, chosen. Could you talk a little bit about other sort of special interests you might see in girls? And I'm thinking as well as they head towards puberty, what the changes might be then.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Rosie. So definitely it's something that we see when we're doing diagnostic assessments. It's always a conversation that we have with the young people that we're assessing, talk about the things that they're really passionate about, that they really love, that brings them joy in their lives. And again, similar to, what you were experiencing, a lot of the young people that I maybe assess might talk about things like, a real intense interest in makeup, but it might not look particularly different from their peers because all their peers are really interested in makeup. But maybe when you start to dig and talk to the autistic young lady a little bit more, and she might say things like, well, yes, I know every name of every lipstick that Estee Lauder has ever created. I watch these YouTubes, on how I do my makeup. So actually the knowledge that they have and the interest is much, much greater or much, much deeper. You might also see interests in animals. That's another real common intense interest that girls can display. So again, you might see, a group of girls who always go down to the riding stables, see their horses, every weekend, and it's just typical, and that's but the autistic girl might not stick out in her intense interest, but actually everything for her is about horses. Her whole bedroom is covered in horse posters. She reads books only about either fact or fiction about horses. She's the girl that when nobody's looking gallops around the corridors, and those sorts of things. So it's definitely looking at things and talking to people and helping them understand what their interest might be. And sometimes that interest might also be a person as well. So we know that autistic young people, particularly girls, sometimes that might be an intense interest in a specific person. That might be a celebrity, but it might be their best friend, it might be a family member. And it's that real intense sort of focus that they might get on that person. They might really struggle then. Say, for example, if that best friend wants to have other friends or wants to do other things. For me, when I'm learning about intense interest in girls, it's really about talking to the young person, or, when I'm doing it in older women as well, talking to them about what are the things that absolutely bring them joy, what are the things that light up their lives.
I'm thinking now about my daughter and masking, because we did an interview not that long ago, didn't we, called "You Don't Look Autistic," and actually that is, I think, another barrier with girls. And she's popular, she's bright, she's sporty, she dances, she's a very early reader, which I now know is a sign. But I knew that she was masking because I was seeing what was happening at home. And I knew, because I have an older autistic child, that was dysregulation, that she had been masking all day. But then I go to the school and I say, initially I thought ADHD, actually. I thought, my daughter's got ADHD. What support is available? And I was very much met with, she's fine. She's fine. And as it happens, I don't believe she was fine. And so I then had an assessment and a diagnosis where they both picked up both that and the autism. And then I go back with my piece of paper and I say, look, I've got an assessment, I've got diagnosis. And it was still very much, but she's fine at school. So as a parent, how can you identify things that you think might be early signs of autism, even if you're coming up against education or family members that might be saying, oh, no, don't be silly, they're fine, they're just stroppy, they're just opinionated, they're just anxious, shy, all of these words that we're talking about. And I know that there is long waiting lists for diagnosis, so sometimes you're going to have to advocate for your child without that bit of paper. So it's a bit of a twofold question, really. I suppose, what are the big markers to look out for, or the little markers even, but the things that are really particular to autism, as opposed to being a neurotypical response to an anxious situation or something like that? And what can you do to advocate?
So I think that Freya as a clinician can talk much more to this, but you're still looking for all those diagnostic signs that are core to autism. So it's certainly true that autistic people have difficulty with sleep and often with eating and so on. Those aren't diagnostic criteria. So the diagnostic criteria will be around rigid and repetitive behavior, but sometimes that will look very different. So we talk about boys lining up toy cars or spinning the wheels of toy cars for hours on end, and that looks very red flag for autism. But if a little girl is lining up her cuddly toys,
tidy,
you think, how sweet, how tidy, you're going to play, maybe going to play school with them or something. Yes. But that's still lining up, and if that's repetitive and doesn't involve a lot of, say, pretend play, or involves pretend play that's very repetitive, so it's copied, and like you say, when somebody else tries to join in with that pretend play, they're not doing it quite right, they're not following the script, I don't want that, no, that's not okay. So we're looking for that rigidity. Sometimes it's rigidity of thought, getting really stuck on something, seeing things very much in black and white, and of course all children feel that way sometimes, but having that as a general style. And then you're looking for the social and communication difficulties. And we've talked about masking. We've talked about how on the surface it might look like a young girl or a young woman is in there with the group laughing at the same time and so on, but actually not quite getting it or getting it wrong. I remember a girl, and this was a case where a girl with a diagnosis of autism, she went to a new school and she didn't want people to know that she was autistic, and her family felt differently about it, but it was her choice. So they didn't tell the class, and she was kind of doing fine, very bright, doing her copying others and making sure she looked like a popular girl in the class and so on. And then out of the blue, somebody in her class died very sadly. And in the assembly where they were told, all her friends started crying and so on. And she was so upset for them, that she tried to cheer them up by making a joke. And of course, it was coming from a good place, but it didn't land right because they didn't know that her processing was different. And so they felt that she was being sort of callous or getting it wrong. If they had known that she was autistic, they probably would have understood that she was just having a very warm response that was coming out in a way that wasn't neurotypical. So getting things wrong socially, even if it's subtle, I think is a key part of recognising autism in girls and in boys.
Yeah, definitely. I'd agree. I think there is something about that awkwardness sometimes of the social, so you can see it's coming from a really good place, but maybe just kind of missing out on kind of like the connection there. And I think as well, so, that some of the things that we'd be looking for is things like, facial expressions and eye contact, gestures, all of those things. And whilst girls, again, sometimes might be doing all of them, it's also, as a diagnostician, I always talk to them about, so I'm noticing you're giving me really good eye contact now. Is that okay? Is that making you feel uncomfortable? And they might just look at me and go, oh, I'm not looking at your eyes at all, I'm looking at your nose. I started doing that ages ago. Or things like I know that I have to, you do sort of what in diagnostic assessments, you do what you saw, so I do social cues. So I might do something like, oh, do you know what, a really exciting thing happened to me the other day? And a lot of autistic people will be like, and there'll be nothing, and you kind of go, okay, so it's a different sort of reciprocal conversation, whereas autistic girls might go, what happened to you the other day? Or what's very often, oh, an interesting thing happened to me the other day. So they might know they have to ask a question, but don't really care about it. But again, a lot of autistic girls and boys actually will be trying to make those connections by telling you the same story. And again, that can be misunderstood and can look like you don't care or you're not listening. So, oh my goodness, a dreadful thing happened to me. I was late on the train and, the train was delayed and I was stuck and I was so tired. An autistic person might say, oh, I remember a time I was stuck on a train and I was really tired and that's awful. A neurotypical person might be like, this isn't about you, this is about me. But the autistic person was going, no, I was completely sympathising with you about that experience. And neither are wrong, they're just different processing styles or different ways of connecting with somebody. But again, they're things that you might want, again, they're things that you can look out for and things you can look at as difference.
We hope the experiences, insights and advice shared today have helped answer some of the questions and concerns that many parents face when seeking a diagnosis for their child. Remember, every autistic child is unique, and a diagnosis is not an endpoint. It's the beginning of better understanding, support and advocacy. Until next time, thank you for listening to Autism Unpacked.